Absolutely. So the next couple slides, folks, and I realize people aren't necessarily going to be talking during the session, but give you a lot of questions to ask to start workshopping and walking through these exercises. Now, some of this you could do here while we're sitting and chatting because you have a lot of this knowledge already. And some of it would be things that you want to take with you and kind of move forward. I am in the process of developing and I'd love your help with this, some rubrics that would, or I should say templates for this kind of rubric where when we start working with an organization, we could provide you, with a document theoretically that helps you walk through some of these steps that you would take for a sustainable launch and initiative. And I will also say a lot of what I'm taking and kind of giving guidance on comes from a background in project and event management. A lot of this activity is really just kind of logistics, right? Certainly there's this cultural aspect where we want to kind of shift the conversation, but a lot of it is also just thinking about things like lead time and promoting in the appropriate channels. So first, and I just want to again turn these to questions for you. Um, each organization and community is going to be unique, right? Of course, we want to come up with kind of templates or guidance, but you will need to, customize and craft your plan for your organization. So keep those goals and the culture of your organization close in mind. The type of research that you produce, the stature and kind of reputation and energy of your organization. How they see the relationship between, say, library and researcher. All of these things will come into play very much. So understanding that and looking for solutions, I think that will fit around that. Then there's a really basic question. Who is going to be using altmetric data? I mentioned earlier, sometimes the original interest in altmetrics comes from the library. This is quite often, quite common at an academic institution. But in other organizations, it might come from the communications department, who is thinking about this data from a slightly different perspective. I would encourage you to look at who you think your users are and then move beyond that and expand and kind of come up with a multi-tiered view of who might be using this data. And then finally, again, and these are some questions that I posed briefly earlier, list out what other departments and stakeholders might use this information. And this is a little different than that end user question. We're not talking about just the people that are going to be in the platform, in the Explorer, or, analyzing this data directly. But who are you going to be reporting and sharing this data with, both internally and externally? I would encourage you right now to list out at least 4 to 5 unique stakeholders that maybe were not a part of the original core group of, say, Altmetric users, or the people that you're thinking about in traditional scholarly impact assessment kind of realms. They might include things like IT, development, e-learning, alumni relations, strategic relations, et cetera. Thinking outside the box, I mean, that's kind of a cliche phrase, but you have so many different, parties and players. With a lot of funders, we're looking at, grants officers, or, with organizations, it might be PIs, people that are actually more in charge with that research itself. And then take from that and identify who the channels of attention are that are the most important to our organization. And this can be, I think, both more broadly. So you do, of course, want to have an idea of, who your administrators and your top level stakeholders are focusing on and valuing, but also how that varies in different departments and for different initiatives even. And so, maybe under that list where you've just listed a couple different departments and stakeholders you'd want to target or reach out to, associate maybe 2 of each of the altmetric attention sources, or 16 sources that you think would be the most value to those stakeholders. Are your it was funny. I'm trying to think of who it was that I had a funny conversation with, where they said, our administrators are really, really focused on policy mentions. That's what they deem impact, right? That when we're mentioned in, global policy recommendations, that's what we're focused on. But they're also really excited when our research ends up in the top 100 Altmetric scoring publications each year. So, there can be variances. The same stakeholders might have different goals as well. And then next, going back to this definition of impact, do you have a very clearly defined definition of impact? Is it set out clearly? And not only a definition, but how do you reward impact? Does your incentive system match up and align with that definition of impact? Sometimes this is something that is askew at organizations and that might require, longer, more cultural kind of development influence conversations. But I think having a clear understanding of that is really necessary at the outset if we're going to kind of advocate for any shift in that reward system. And please do, like I said, as we're chatting here, I know folks can't talk, but if you want to pop any feedback or comments into the question or chat feature as well, about your current experiences with reward systems at your institution or organization, definitions of impact, if these have shifted. I'm really curious to see, even in the past year or two, if we're seeing a different kind of conversation. I feel really lucky that I get to interact with and support all of our different customer segments. So, academic institutions, funders, government agencies, NGOs, et cetera. And I find, the conversations are actually really similar, that folks who are producing, supporting, publishing research tend to talk about the same types of broader societal impact. They really are tuned into this. Now, of course, our incentive systems are behind, but I do think that the climate seems to be optimistic, at least from my perspective. And then finally, it can be really valuable to be prepared to discuss any kind of misconceptions or expectations around altmetric data. The assumption that this is just social media, or that altmetric data is very easily gameable. As Dr. Bowman discussed, we know that citations can be gameable as well. We've got lots of materials and resources to help you, with talking points, be prepared to answer these questions. And I would say having these conversations is really important to help shift, again, the dynamic of where scholarship sits right now. Go forward one. So one of my driving ethos is this idea of letting context and narrative really drive data and analysis. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I feel like this is something that we really do want to encourage and push. And I love that I, again, get to work with our clients all over the world as well, because I spent a bunch of time recently in the UK and Europe, and working with a lot of UK academic institutions that are dealing with the resource excellence framework. So they have to report regularly on impact beyond scholarly impact, so broader social impact, related to the research outputs that are being produced and supported by their institution. And this is a quote from the guidance related to developing these reports. And what they end up doing is having to develop impact case studies, or these narrative descriptions. And when you look at these case studies online, what you realize very quickly is that these case studies use basically altmetric data. And I don't mean specifically our data in a proprietary sense, but they're using altmetrics as the evidence of this type of impact. They're showing that their research was discussed on a BBC News report, that it was mentioned in a World Health Organization recommendations on marketing of food to children. This type of, again, data is shown and used to indicate that they are having broader impact. The next ref exercise will be for 2020. I come from working strongly in an open access librarian background, and I've seen, how the community in Europe and the UK has helped filter into terms of like funder mandates and other things like that in the US. So I'm really hopeful that this emphasis on contextual narrative data around impact will really start to also filter in and affect how we approach things in the United States. Oh, sorry here. So I have some tips and ideas for this idea of crafting an impact statement. And obviously you'll get these slides afterwards so you can use them yourselves. But I want to, a lot of times what you see is this idea and encouragement of walking through a bit of a journalistic kind of approach, a who, what, where, when, why. And this I think is really useful to think about who benefited from this research, what that impact or benefit really was, where that benefit occurred, when it occurred. So, with the ref and a lot of these mandated reporting on impact, they have to show, actual time frames, which is really great because you can track things like that with Altmetrics data as well. We can benchmark and see during specific periods of time or after publication, et cetera. Then we want to look at how that research translates to impact. Again, what is that connection? And then finally, why that type of impact is important. And that importance, could be something from saving lives to, promoting cultural inclusivity. There's such a range of types of impact, which is why it's so important to really craft these, in a narrative way that is really tied into the goals and impact of that research area and even that individual researcher. So some of the tips that we talk about, use narrative to clearly outline the research impact. We are really used to just pulling to numbers, and I think you can pull in numbers, but I think bolstering those numbers with things like, qualitative data is really key. For example, we can say, our research was shared in, 30 countries globally on 4 platforms of, attention. It resulted in, 4 patents in these jurisdictions, as well as, X number of policy recommendations. All really valuable data. But we can then take that and highlight some specific examples, those recommendations of, food policy safety. A tweet from a researcher that says, this is really important. That faculty of 1000 recommendation tagline that says this is an exciting new finding. All of those can be, again, deeper examples that we can pull out. It's going to be really valuable to explain the relationship between the piece of research and the impact. I think the conversation about patents today alludes to the fact that this can be cloudy or difficult to discern sometimes. But I think that altmetric data can be a really strong way to help support understanding those relationships, again, between distribution, visibility, and downstream impact. Most exercises that require impact statements identify the type of impact, so consider categorizing if appropriate. Again, these are just tips. If this kind of specificity isn't relevant or appropriate for your area of research, I wouldn't say this is some hard fast rule. But if you are, going to be producing research, in another country or working in some of these kind of funder mandated situations, you might have to do something like this where you acknowledge what type of impact this research is. And then finally, what's the extent of the impact? Does it stop? Does it continue on? Does it involve multiple communities? Include specific references and examples. Again, create this narrative of, how a researcher is able to bring value to the research and translate that into broader impact. And of course, this requires us to really connect back to that scholarly mission, or the individual research mission of the author themselves. So if you're in the capacity where you're working directly with researchers, I would really encourage you to ask those same kind of reflective questions with them. Maybe in an appointment or a meeting that you have with them around publication planning, or preparation for tenure and promotion, or development of their scholarly profile. Have them think about these things. Of course, every researcher, it has to attend to their own professional development. They want, their research to be seen and built upon, and they have to work within the systems and limitations, of the organization for which they are affiliated. That said, they might not have really taken a step back since they got really further along in their career to think about some of these original questions. Why did they get into research in the first place? It probably was related to, at least in part, some of these more broader societal impact areas. Interested in saving lives, development of knowledge and innovation, et cetera. Ask them then also questions about their research and information discovery. Where do they go to find out about important research? What kind of collaborations could be beneficial to them? There's been a lot of really interesting studies that have come out recently that show connections between blogging and downstream citations. Now, I really like again, Dr. Bowman's approach that we don't need to analyze altmetrics within the context of citations. They are, different pools of data that tell us different things and different types of potential impact. That said, I understand we are still in a scholarly communication a world where citations are dominant, and I think it's interesting to me that blogging in particular has this correlation with downstream citation increase, because it shows the fact that communicating things in a new way to new audiences, but also the new trend to synthesize and curate information. Researchers are overwhelmed with how much research is being published. Practitioners, do not have time, doctors, to filter through every scholarly article produced or every data set that's published. So the idea that a blog can, give another scholar or researcher or research office the opportunity to synthesize all of this information, potentially across disciplinary boundaries, into a way that delivers scholarly content to audiences that can build upon it more readily, I think is really powerful. And some of the research has shown very, very strong correlations in fields where citation rates are low, like health professions and nursing, where there was a 36.8% increase to citations downstream when research was blogged about. These are all is information that I can share with you as well. Again, I think understanding how we can craft our message in different ways is really key. And that's kind of what I lead into with the last couple slides. How can we prioritize adaptive, personalized relationship building? And how can we tailor our message and delivery? A couple of the speakers earlier, Rebecca in particular at University of Michigan, talked about the fact that the way we engage with a provost is going to be different than the way we engage with a researcher, or even the way we engage with a linguistics researcher is going to be different than how we engage, with a biomedical researcher. So thinking about, again, this communication delivery pathway, kind of putting on our PR and promotion hats, where and how do we engage with various organizational stakeholders? And here I'm talking more about internal. So when we're thinking about an Altmetric launch at our institution, how can we get to those different user groups and stakeholders? Where do they receive and process information? The ways and places that you advertise to graduate students are not going to be the same as the ways you advertise to tenured faculty. The ways that tenured faculty want to receive and take on training or data related to a new service or tool might also be different than how a communications staff person does. So what sort of engagement activities and events are going to work for your community? Do lunch and learns, and coffee chats work really well, better than webinars? Do in-person workshops work well? Or do you have top-level administrators that just want a compact 30-minute presentation that gives them the data without asking them to be an end user? Being flexible to, again, deliver these messages and engage with folks and meet them where they're at will be really key to getting broad support and engagement around Altmetrics. And then finally, this is, just a really basic kind of logistic item, but I worked in social media, public relations, PR, and outreach and marketing for years. And, one of the biggest trip ups is not having enough lead time. I would really suggest, while this varies at institution and organization to organization, 2 to 3 weeks might not be enough time to announce a training session. You might want more time than that. You might want to do teasers, some sort of messaging campaign first that gets people excited. Don't be afraid to experiment with those different approaches. And also, you can never be too organized in really having a thorough, fleshed out launch plan and goals for continued sustainability. So here I've got some kind of key ideas that I'm using to build out these templates for you. But when you're thinking about planning your Altmetric launch and beyond, first, really conduct an environmental scan. And this really should happen, even as you're implementing, a tool like Altmetric Explorer, identifying who your stakeholders and users are. And then going through that process of aligning strategy with mission and goals. Maybe user personas can help guide this. And I've got a couple sample example slides next to show you that process. Then your schedule, right? Consider internal and outreach channels. Is there a specific newsletter that you want to get an announcement into? Are you trying to organize around an academic schedule so you don't want to be going during finals, obviously, or something like that? If you're working at a funding organization, do you have specific funding cycles or grant periods that are really vital where you need to be working within those constraints? Finally, next for training engagement, think about format, focus, and timing. When I work with organizations, and we talk about some initial sets of trainings and engagement, I really encourage them to think about multiple approaches. So we might want multiple sessions of the same type to saturate attendance, but we also might want to record those sessions so people can access them and stream them later. We might want a specific session focused on researchers, another focused on social media and communication managers. Another that's again more looking at top level administrators and how to keep them on board with this program. Then you follow up with resources and collateral, right? Make sure people have the information they need, that you're able to send them updates, as new data sources are added to our tools, that you're disseminating that information, in the pathways and areas that those audiences are going to be able to receive and process them. And then finally, I would really encourage you to think beyond, just this launch and about next level engagement. We have research staff and librarians who contact us and say, I was working with this scholar who has this exciting new digital humanities website they're working on, and we're thinking about in advance that we want to be able to track that content. How would we do that? That's so awesome to be proactive like that, because there are things you can do in advance. Setting up canonical meta tags is going to be really key to be able to track that content, assigning identifiers if that's the path that you're going to go. Thinking about it again from a communication and visibility standpoint. But also just proactively of thinking of, do I have a whole department where they're producing a whole bunch of conference proceedings? Can we get those materials into our repository and start tracking those in terms of Altmetrics? That will really help when that faculty member comes to you down the line and says, I need evidence to show impact for, my review or for, a funding submission, et cetera. Collaborations, this event is a really great opportunity to interact with and hear what your peers and other folks are doing in the research community. I'd really encourage you to keep that dialogue going. Join the Altmetric ambassadors, attend conferences if able. It's a really exciting community that's involves a lot of different research players, which is what I think is really interesting. It's not just, librarians, and I'm a librarian, I love librarians, but, when you go to library conferences or research conferences, you're often in a kind of a silo and you're just hearing one perspective, which is why I love that today we got some academic perspectives, a communications department perspective, and then we also got a funder perspective, right? We're all kind of working towards the same goals. So I think we can really learn a lot from each other. And we love to do research. Stacy is, our head lead on and really all things thought leadership related to Altmetrics and beyond. If there's collaboration in that respect, I present at conferences. As I said, I've been working with Virginia Tech on a pretty in-depth research process or project related to user personas that we presented on at the Open Repositories Conference and are continuing to develop. So please do let us know. We would love to partner with you and come up with projects and research areas that will really kind of take the Altmetrics research area to the next level. So finally, I just wanted to finish up before questions with a little bit of chat about this user persona idea, because I think it can be really useful for approaching Altmetrics at our institution. And if you're not familiar with user personas, these are hypothetical kind of profiles that are developed that are supposed to improve functionality and quality of a service or tool. They developed originally out of web design kind of user experience work. But they've been adopted by libraries and academia for over a decade now. And they involve this rigorous qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis. And our goal with them is to really develop an understanding of a researcher's workflow, identify the key technical skills that would be unique and necessary for that specific persona, and the universal features and functionality that align with that. We want to be really careful to evoke empathy. Our goal is not to create stereotypes, but to really audit and recognize where we're making assumptions and enhance that with qualitative data. And then again, be iterative and collaborative and have this be this ongoing critical reflexive process. User personas are not fixed documents. They're very much living things that move and develop. And in terms of altmetrics, as I mentioned in the question session, we want to start with this primary and secondary data collection, understand what our assumptions are around user categories and what the attributes are that align with each, and then look at these development of these personas in terms of potential frustrations, motivations, etc. And so with Virginia Tech, as I mentioned, we started out, we're developing some kind of assumptive initial proto-personas, and now as we're mediating through IRB process, we're sending out survey questions to 4 different researchers at Virginia Tech, really trying to hone in on their research process, their research communication process and pathway, how they have these roles and relationships with non-academic communities, and again, how they connect to those communities in terms of exchanging and sharing research. And so we really separated into these 4 ideas. So attributes, which connects to the type of research output, what the researchers' frustrations might be, what their motivations are, and what their goals are. ARAC stands for, these are the experimental farms that are out in the field. So we had 4 different types of personas at Virginia Tech that we're looking at. And I'm not going to walk through this all, but as you can see, we worked through with Inga, our liaison librarian, who has this extensive knowledge already, to make some initial data assumptions and assessments about the types of questions, frustrations, and goals, et cetera, that altmetric data can hopefully help to answer or inform. So with that, I am finished up, and I want to make sure we have time for any questions. I'm sorry if I went a couple minutes over for questions.